Niedawno otwierałem pierwszy Comic Con w Polsce. To się wydarzyło pod Warszawą. Wydarzyła się rzecz niesamowita, a ja wszyscy się tak cieszyli ze spotkania z paroma osobami, że aż udało się wydobyć potężny krzyk. Czy my możemy przywitać Edwarda jakimś krzykiem, typu Edward! Those who need to be addressed in English, we have Edward Norton here. The man who we admire, the man who we love, the man who inspires us, but above all, the man who does incredible things, not only as an actor, but also as a human being. So, welcome, Edward Norton.
I will just say one sentence in Polish and then I will switch into English. Proszę Państwa, witamy Państwa bardzo serdecznie na festiwalu Transatlantyk. Welcome Edward, it's such a pleasure and an absolute honor to have you here. The first question for you tonight is, let's go back to the very beginning. I know that your father was an environmental lawyer, your mother was a English teacher. When was it that you first got the bug?
There was a girl in my neighborhood growing up who was kind of a babysitter for us. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I saw her perform in the local theater school play, and I was very struck by it. And so she took me to sign me up for little classes for 5-year-olds, and that was the beginning, I suppose. My parents weren't artists at all, but they were the kind of people who keep all of us in business. They loved the arts, and they took us to the theater and to movies and to concerts all the time. So we were constantly seeing, and then as a family discussing films. And my mother had the films she loved and introduced me to Woody Allen and the things she liked most, and my father had the ones he loved, and so I feel like they really cultivated my sense of the arts as not just entertainment, but something that was important. But I never really thought seriously about. I did it like a kid does everything. I played sports, I did my theater stuff, and we made movies with my friends, but all just for fun, It was never even in my head that it was something you did for real. And then maybe when I was, when I was a teen, in school, I went to public school, and the idea of theater was not cool, it wasn't things. And I remember I was doing a play, and then I realized that some girls from my school might come to see the play, and I got terrified. Like I quit. I said I'm not doing this anymore, because I got very embarrassed about the idea of performing, and then I had one teacher who took. I don't know why she picked me. She picked a few kids, and she took us to see Ian McKellen was doing a tour of this one-man show, and I think I was 17, and I saw him give this performance, and it was about Shakespeare, and it was about his life performing Shakespeare and what he learned by performing Shakespeare, and also about Shakespeare as an artist. And it was so amazing. It was so, and he was alone on the stage, and he just, you know, in the huge National Theater, and he just, and I remember when I left that I remember thinking, this is something very big, you know, this is very serious, and this is something you could actually do. And then I started to get more interested in the idea of it.
Is my information correct? You actually at some point ended up on the stage with Ian McKellen in the production of Macbeth. Is that?
No, that was that time. I was when I was 16. He did a thing in his performance. He asked for volunteers, and I went up, and many people came up. You know, dozens of people, and he came up and whispered. He said, you know, lie down and be dead. You know, and so. And then he did the speed. He did Macbeth on the battlefield. You know, tomorrow and these things. And he but I was right under him, kind of looking up at him. And
no lines to speak.
No lines to speak. But he had an enormous effect on me. And many people, I think. But even still, when I went to university and I studied history and I was doing other things, and I kept doing plays, and I just felt, I don't know, maybe in my 20s, when I was in New York in my 20s, I never was one of those people who was like, I am an actor, I'm going to make movies. You know, it was very slow, it was slow for me.
So there was no like romantic dimension to that, or like an adventure of someone going to New York and...
Oh no, there was. I was doing other things, but the whole romance of the New York theater was a huge draw for me. I loved the idea of it. It was partly, I can't explain it. I went to public school my whole life, and then I got to go to this great university. And there was a part of me that I think almost I felt like I had been given this opportunity to go and get this great education, and then I thought being an actor was like irresponsible.
Oh, like a trivial pursuit?
Yeah, I thought which was foolish, but I just sort of felt like I got this education, and my grandfather paid for it, and I shouldn't. This is self-indulgent. This is, you know, narcissistic. It's like, and in a way, fortunately, my grandfather, who was a great thinker and everything, he actually said to me, he said that's why do what you want to do, or do what gives you pleasure, and you'll find your way to contribute eventually. You know what I mean? So he was very influential, but it took me a while. I was doing theater in New York, but I had an opportunity to work for the U.S. government in Asia, and I almost did it. I almost left and went and worked in Hanoi, in Vietnam, and quit the whole thing. But
well, we're certainly
different.
lucky that you didn't. But well, at that time, I mean, when you decided to go to New York and you studied at Yale, early '90s, that was the moment when, you know, independent movies in America really sort of got their momentum. You know, the Sundance movement and people like Steven Soderbergh. Did you feel that sort of vibe in the air that interesting things are happening, and you know, there's actually some creative force that hopefully you will join one day?
Yeah, I did. I think that the funny thing about my experience was that I've had lots of people say to me, even, you know, Peter Biskind, when he was writing that book about independent...
Principles.
Yeah, when he was doing the one about film in the 90s. Yeah. And he said, well, I want to talk to you because of... And I said, why? He said, because I'm doing this book about independent film in the 90s. And I said, what? I said, that's nothing to do with me. And he said, you did all these films that, I said, all of those were studio movies. You know, I think people think that you know, these films we did, like American History X and Fight Club and Rounders, all of those were done at major studios, and I think that's what's interesting about that is that I think people take for granted, they forget that in that period, a lot of us coming along, you know, David Fincher and Paul Thomas Anderson and Spike Jonze, and a lot of us we were actually getting to make those films at studios. They were making those films at studios, and but there was a sensation, I think, that our crowd or our group of people was getting a chance to make some films we wanted to make, and it was very exciting. I think whenever you're first starting, you do anything. You don't. It's not like, oh, I'm going to wait for a great. You just do anything that you can. But by in '99, by that time I felt like some of us had earned some credit. You know, like we'd done some things, and in 1999, I felt was a very exciting year. It was actually 98, we were making the movies, but we were making Fight Club, and Alexander Payne was making Election, David Russell was making Three Kings, Paul was making Magnolia.
Terrence Malick did his big...
Yeah, the Matrix was coming out. In that year, I remember, the Wachowskis were making The Matrix, we made Fight Club, Election, Three Kings, Magnolia, Being John Malkovich. All of those films we made, and they all came out, and I remember thinking, this is us. You know, this is a lot of us. There's a sense of a generational voice in this year, and that was exciting.
Well, I think many of us do remember that very time, because those movies, all except Election, which didn't open here until it came out on DVD, but all those movies opened here and they made a huge impact. I want to move to your breakthrough role, which we discussed briefly, but we definitely have to mention it. I mean the role in Primal Fear, which brought you your first of 3 Oscar nominations. You played Aaron, the altar boy who, well, everyone saw the movie, I hope Slaughters.
What did they call it here?
That one actually had exactly the same title. It was Lane Kidlock, the Primal Fear. Earlier on I told Edward that many of his movies actually have very different titles here in college. So that role, I think, in many ways, I mean, I don't want to say defined you, because you did so many different things in the years, but the character that you played, Aaron, which in the short, to make this long story short, is someone with two personalities. I mean, he plays one to cover up for his crime. One is sort of the stuttering, very, introverted boy, and the other one is, the evil mastermind. We all remember the movie. It was shown here yesterday. Tell us just briefly about your process of working on that part. Is it really like preparing for 2 different parts for an actor, or is are you playing a single character, and are you thinking of Aaron in terms of a single character with two minds?
It was a long time ago, and what I was thinking about at the time, I only partially remember, but I think that my feeling. The funny thing is, in the script, he was supposed to be very innocent, but there was no stuttering or there was no indication of how he was getting people to sympathize with him. And I remember around the time that I was auditioning for it, I remember a friend of mine was involved with an organization that helped children who stutter by having people teach them to read a story out loud or something. And I wasn't volunteering, but I remember with my friend, going to the dinner for the kids who stuttered, and then they would get up and sing or perform or something, and talking to a lot of these kids, it made me realize, like, when someone is struggling to speak, it kind of rips your heart. You're listening and you're dying to help them in a way. And I remember thinking that's what this guy should do. He should, because he's a con man. You know, the character is an actor. He's an actor. He's a person who putting on complete performance. But I remember thinking to myself, if he's good, what he would do is the thing that would make people just most manipulate them. And so I had this notion, and I started doing it in auditions, and they liked it, and we kept it up. But mostly, you know, honestly, for me, I thought that the most challenging thing about that was simply that I think you had to be committed to the idea that he was kind of, like you said, a masterful faker, a manipulator.
In a way, an actor,
an actor, a person who's got a very sharp sense of how to manipulate the thing. But you know, it was quite fun because it was kind of a puzzle. It was like, you know, and everybody was we were all in on it, trying to work on it together. But in many ways, I think that it worked. To give credit to the director, Greg Hoblet, and the people involved, it worked partly because they said, let's use someone that nobody's ever seen. And I think whatever I did, I think a lot of credit goes to the fact that they were willing to take the bet on someone no one knew, because Greg had this sensation that this is really going to hit you hard if you don't know this person. You won't have any reason not to believe them, just like the lawyer. And he was right. I think it turbocharged the impact.
Yeah, because at that time for the audience, you were sort of a blank slate. We didn't know what to project onto you. So that was I think tremendously effective. Funnily enough, that Oscar ceremony that year when you were nominated was the very first ceremony in history that was actually broadcast live in Poland. So that was the first time I do remember it. I watched it in the middle of the night. And then, of course, you did People vs. Larry Flint, and you became the Woody Allen character in Everyone Says I Love You. But what I want to fast forward to is, of course, your performance that I think electrified everyone. And in this country, the movie became an absolute cult classic, which is Fight Club. Podziemny Krąg, Underground Circle.
Underground Circle.
Right. And that movie, I do remember when I must have been 16, 17 when I watched it. I mean, it was like a slap in the face. I mean, it was so powerful in every possible way. What I learned recently is that it was very long shooting period. How many days did you work on that movie? I mean, it was like 100 days or something?
No, we actually shot it for about 130 days. Yeah, it was about 7 months, which was long. We rehearsed. It was most of a year. We did it for most of a year.
But when you were working on it, I mean, David Fincher, of course, is such a distinctive, personality and such a stylist. How aware were you at the time when you were playing the part of how the movie will look like? Like, because the look of the film, the feel of it, were you aware of that at all? Or?
Yeah, well, first of all, David was already such a distinctive visual filmmaker, and I was, like everybody else, I was already a big fan of it, and I knew, you had a sense of his aesthetics if you watched the Seven and The Game and things like that. But also, he's such an he's so organized, and so, his planning is so beautifully detailed that he had like I remember him having 8 or 9 huge binders, books of just photographic compositions and modeling. This was he was starting to work with some computer pre-visualization, but even that wasn't really coming along. It was kind of the last moment of people doing storyboards and things. The thing that bound us all up was in some ways more the humor, because I think David's really funny, Brad's funny, Helen is very funny. The guy, Andy Walker, who did a lot of the work on revising the script and stuff. And I think it was one of those experiences where once everybody looked at each other and said, we all think this is funny, right? And they said, yes. They said, okay, we're on the same page. I think if it hadn't been laced with a sense of irony and humor, it might have been too, David used to say, I always cheat to steal his line, but he used to say, this was a film that got taken very seriously, that was made by very unserious people. but I think that if you read the book, you knew it was about us. It was about us and our friends, and I think someone I was talking to today, I think one of your newspapers, was saying, could you make that movie now? And I thought it was a good question, because I think the answer is no, because so much of what the film was about, so much of what we were all afraid of was so new, and now I feel like we're defeated. We've lost. Starbucks has won, and the iPhone has won, and we're cyborgs, and we get our coffee from franchises, and we've given up. But then I think it felt like, I think in the late 90s it was still everybody of that age had this sensation of what is happening? What is happening to the world? What is this strange sensation of everything becoming the same everywhere? And I don't think if you made it today, it would feel quite as edgy.
Although I did rewatch it a couple of days ago, and I was struck by how completely it describes the sort of zeitgeist in Poland right now. Because back when we were watching it in 1999, I feel that the sort of corporate capitalism was still something very,
That's true.
far away.
Yeah.
And now we are living through it. So in that
I'm
way,
sorry.
I think we are at that moment.
It only gets worse.
But two things about this performance that are very striking. First, which is I think more obvious, is the physical dimension. I mean, did you get injured making that film? I mean, it looks dangerous, the stuff that you do.
Yeah, I think it was a film that it was inevitable. There was no way. And David famously does many, many, many takes. So you would do something and you would think, oh, in the beginning you'd think, oh, we did it, we did that, and we didn't get hurt. But you knew it couldn't last, because he would do it. He would basically do it until you got hurt, and then he would say, "That's a good one," and then he'd move on. It was there's a part in the film when toward the end when he throws me through some glass, and there's a great shot. I sort of fall through the glass and then crawl on a garage under a car, and the camera's going along past the tire, and then Brad kind of drags me back and then beats me with a shoe. And we were doing it, and because I had my underwear on, I couldn't have pads or anything, so I kept crawling across the garage floor, and my knee, so there was just nothing to stop it, so my knees were getting all cut and bleeding, and because Brad was grabbing me by this trench coat and dragging me, it sort of cut my armpits, and I started bleeding through the coat, and Brad got very upset. David just kept doing it and kept doing it. He did it like 20 or 30 times, and Brad got very upset at one point and just said, he said, no, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not doing it. Look at him. Look at him, like it's just, and David said, just one more. And Brad kept saying, no, he said, I'm not doing it anymore. And they'd known each other a long time, and he said, come on, do it one more time. So we did it, and he just said to me, he said, go really fast. And I said, okay, so I just went across, and I hit my head on the underside of the car so badly that my neck was out for like the rest of the shoot, but it's in the movie though. Okay, yeah.
Well, any notion of acting as Trivial Pursuit after that, I think, is completely done. Another dimension of this performance, and to move forward, is when I was watching it recently again, your voice work, the whole narration, the tone. I was surprised to discover how much of the movie is actually driven by the narration that you do. But the tone is very interesting. It's like this droning, like flat. Not a lot of emotion in the narration. How do you remember sort of coming up with that voice, finding that voice?
That's an interesting question. David was really he's a technical perfectionist in the extreme, and to say we did it over and over is just it was like an exercise. It almost became Dada. We did it so many times. And David he'd change the mic, and then he'd do a combination of mics, and then he would put it here, and then he would put it 50 feet away, and then he'd change the room, and then he would change the mics again, and he kept looking for the thing that felt like it was a voice inside a head, and we played with. Is it more serious? Is it more funny? It was a long process of work to get that kind of sound. Although I think David in Seven, there's Morgan Freeman's got that thing too, and there's a hypnotic quality that somehow. The funny thing about David, I have to say, is that Fincher is people. Once someone becomes known like Fincher, it's like their excesses of lots of takes and all these things, they almost become more of a story about the person than a reality, or it starts to become something people like to just say that because it's something they've heard about him. But the truth is that there's not many people I would say this about. He actually knows the difference between there's a real difference. He actually, some people do that kind of work because they're showing off. There's really no difference between number 1 and number 20 in most people's hands.
Trying to be Kubrick.
They're essentially trying to be like him because they've heard that. But he actually has a technical discernment. He has an ear and an eye that I am willing to say there is a real difference. He actually has the chops. He has the talent to see things and hear things in a way that it's worth giving him the time that he wants, because he achieves something that's different than most people, and I don't think it's just, and there's not that many people I think you would give that much leeway to, in some sense. He delivers a kind of a unique aesthetic to it, and I think it's hard. The funny thing is sometimes people, like, they're gonna make a commercial, for a car and they want a voiceover, and they want it to sound like Fight Club, and so we've gotten these calls. They say, would you come in and read this thing, and they'll offer you money to like do a thing for a commercial, and they say, and they always try not to say it, but eventually what they say is, well, really what we're trying to get is kind of that Fight Club kind of quality. And I it's the point at which I always know I'm not going to do this, because I end up saying, the thing is, like, you're not David Fincher, and this commercial for a truck is not the text of Fight Club. It's not going to be as good. Like, I'm sorry. And so it's just like sort of given up. It's like
that would be the ultimate irony, to use that voice, to
Yes.
merchandise.
Yeah.
Well,
I should do it for Starbucks. That would be the best.
oh, absolutely.
Flat white.
Before
Macchiato.
before I'm opening this up to our audience, there's one more movie that I would like to definitely ask you about. I mean, American History X, Więzień Nienawiści, Prisoner of Hatred in Poland. Which actually I think opened here after Fight Club did, but well, that was your Oscar-nominated performance. Nothing funny about that movie. You played a neo-Nazi character named Derek who does commits a horrific act of violence, and there's sort of, you know, undergoes a change of heart in prison. You went to a very, very dark place in building that role. I mean, you had to sort of, you know, delve deep down into where hatred is born, I guess. A very, very challenging and brave performance. What was that process like? I mean, of finding that, I guess, darkness within. I mean, how did you prepare for that?
My friend David, who wrote the script, and then he gave it to me, and we spent like half a year working on that script together and thinking about it. And the thing that I felt was a story with the same qualities as what I like about Shakespeare's plays, like Othello or Macbeth or something like that, and tying it back to Ian McKellen and talking about the thing that Ian talked about when he talked about Shakespeare was the realization, as you perform these plays, that this was a writer who really tapped deep themes that still have meaning for us, or the questions that we're still asking. And I think that in particular, like when Ian talked about performing Shakespeare, it's the realization that this idea of Shakespeare had a very unique quality of creating characters who have many, many, many admirable qualities, and then they have one flaw, one quality of their personality that's excessive, and it brings them down. You know, Macbeth, it's his ambition, and Othello, his jealousy, and Lear, his pride. All, you know, this is like the university kind of version of it. But when I read what David, I thought, had tapped into was this idea of a contemporary character. What I liked about it was, instead of making the character a villain or just an object of terror, he basically had the courage to say, I'm gonna create a character, you know, terrifying in his rage, but who is clearly could have been anything, could have been, is intelligent, is charismatic, cares about his family, has many, many qualities, so that you can't dismiss him. You can't say, well, this is just a criminal. This is just a thug. He's just an unredeemable person. By writing a character who clearly has qualities, and examining not only what created this rage in him, but showing him past the point where he's realized that that rage has ruined him and ruined his family. This became very interesting, right? And in many ways, I think the thing I contributed most in the beginning was, I said to David, I think you're shooting too low. I think we should approach this like Othello. You know, we should approach this character like Macbeth or Othello. That is what it is. And we should approach it stylistically that way. It is the film is very heightened. It's what Tony Kaye, I think, did best in shooting the film. It has a very, that's doing it in black and white. It's not entirely, it's actually,
It's very expressionistic.
yeah, it's very expressionistic. It's not actually hyper real. It is, because it's a contemporary kind of gritty story, but Tony shot the film almost like a Leni Riefenstahl kind of expressionistic quality to it, right? And that was amongst us. We had the discussion. We said, like, let's not make a naturalistic film. Let's make a classical tragedy, and that I felt that was what, for me, what it was rooted in. Like, and then once, and the thing that was good about that for me was that it gave a freedom to, there was the obvious like physical expression, but it let me give him a dimension of intellectual capability and love and all these things that made it more interesting.
Well, I think that it worked beautifully, and I think in general you are fantastic in creating those performances that are very layered. I mean, in Derek you created some very aggressive, he especially the black and white parts, but there are movies like The Painted Veil, which I happen to like a lot, or The Illusionist, when it's all contained within the character. I mean, you don't allow yourself, those outbursts. But we in the audience, we constantly feel that there's this layers upon layers of stuff happening within your character, and I think that's very admirable, I guess. Let's open this up a little bit. I would like to also ask you about your environmental activism, but before I do, let's give the audience.
How many, do we have? Is some of the university? Do we have a lot of the?
How many students from the film school? Which film school are with us? Raise your hands. There are a couple. Yeah.
Because this is it's exciting. For a lot of us who the original touch point is Roman Polanski and things like that. Like I know we were talking earlier about how you were saying when you were growing up, Western films and things were so rare. But in a weird way for us, people like Polanski and these things that we only get drips and drabs in the midst of it. And so we know, people like me and Brett Ratner and people who are big fans of Polanski, the Łódź is kind of a legendary status because it's like, oh, that's the great Eastern European place that produced Polanski and all these things. So I hope it still has that vibrancy of the tradition of.
Oh, I think it definitely has, and we all appreciate that you're saying this, and of course Transatlantic is helping also to make it even more alive. Anyone? Można podnieść rękę, ja przetłumaczę pytanie. We have a question over there. What was it like to work with Wes Anderson on the set?
Basically we're all the same when it comes to Wes. We're just fans, and I think all the actors who work in Wes's films, in many ways, you embrace. I don't think I've ever worked with anybody where some of the best actors in the world are happy to just be a puppet. It's like being he's so specific, and when Wes says his own lines, it's funnier than you'll ever. So when I work with Wes, I'm not actually exaggerating at all. He starts to roll, and I will say it, and then he says it, and then I say it. And then I'll say, Hosika, I'll say it again. And I have him say it, and then I just say it. Like to me, there's no way to, you don't invent a character in Wes's films. He invents a character, and he hangs clothes on you, and moves you through the frame in the way, like it's like being a part of, it's like a boy who has a little box theater. And he's the director and the art director and the thing, and he moves and if he could say the lines, he would. But it makes it really fun because it's very freeing.
Ktoś jeszcze?
I have a microphone, so perhaps.
Oh, there you go.
Start here.
Oh yeah, there you are. No.
Here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Hello, my name is Eva. I'm a huge fan, and I work for a local division of Warner Brothers. We had an honor to distribute many of your movies, Collateral Beauty last year, so it's great to have you here. I actually have two questions. So when I told one of my best friends that I was going to attend a masterclass with you, we know you from many independent movies, but in fact his reaction was, oh my God, you're going to meet Hulk. So I would like to ask you about this particular experience, because we know that superhero movies are having a huge time now everywhere, and you're essentially a part of Marvel universe in a way. So yeah, a bit about that experience. And another thing is your directing career, because we know Keeping the Faith, your first movie, incidentally translated as Forbidden Fruit in Poland. So another one to your collection of strange titles. And I read that you're currently working on Motherless Brooklyn, and it seems like a very interesting project. So I'd like to hear more about it. Thank you.
Thanks. People never really talk about, the studio people, but if you're at Warner, you work under one of my favorite people in all of the film business, Sue Kroll.
Yeah.
Yeah, who's like, you can't appreciate how rare it is to love the marketing and distribution executive at a studio, but Sue Kroll is like one of the great tastemakers, and in all of like the film industry, I absolutely adore her. So you're lucky to be under her team. My feeling, I grew up on comic books, like I loved them. I actually subscribed to a whole bunch of them, and they used to come like a porno magazine with a brown wrapper, And I think my mother was like, what are you getting in the mail all the time that's in a brown wrapper? But it was like, and I would get the X-Men and Spider-Man and Hulk and like all of them. I went through my phases and stuff, but so for one thing, I always felt growing up that these graphic novels, if you were fan, you didn't even want to call them comics, they were these incredibly rich psychological things, especially for when you're an adolescent. I think when you're in that period, because I think at that time in your life you want to have superpowers to escape your youth, basically. And I think and on top of that, I always thought the Hulk was kind of one of the most interesting ones, because in a weird way, I almost think it's an environmental fable, because it's like he messes with nature and he's burned. It's like almost like the myth of Proteus or something like. He plays with the fire and it gets permanently, transformed and exiled. And so it has a great mythic dimension. And at that time, I had never made an effects movie. Like I mean, Fight Club had its thing, but a proper, full-on
CGI.
Yeah, CGI kind of a film. And I've always felt about movies, I can be drawn to making a movie for all kinds of reasons, and the technical experience of doing one of those, combined with it being something, things made it really fun. It was just fun. It was fun. It's the best thing about those two. It's happened with Spider-Man. It's happened with all these. They become weirdly it's almost like Hamlet. Like, how many actors have played Hamlet? Like, many. And some of these characters are starting to become things that they're literally getting reinterpreted over and over. Maybe too much, honestly, but they go through all these iterations, and I think that's a testament to. I do think it's a testament to kind of the mythic quality of them. I think that so it was. I had a lot of fun despite things. People. I thought it was a really interesting and different experience for me. As far as directing, I think I didn't mean to wait longer, and I'm trying to put something together to direct maybe this winter, and I hope it works out. That's I would like to, and
You
hopefully.
mentioned the environment in connection with Hulk, so let me sort of jump on that and ask you about your environmental activism, because I think, that's become such a huge part of what you are right now. I mean, you are Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations and for biodiversity, and you are running the CrowdRise microfunding. It's a huge part of your life, of your career, of who you are as an artist, as a citizen of the world. What is the most difficult thing that you sort of run up against when you are trying to make people more aware about the environment? I mean, is there I don't know, denial or indifference?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think the truth is, if you look, despite how actually terrifying I think the prospect of global environmental collapse, climate change, all these things is, looking at it from a slightly more optimistic angle, we've really only been aware, as a civilization, we've really only been aware that indeed we are affecting the climate for a matter of a few decades. And even though we have these very regressive forces, mostly corporate, pushing against the acknowledgement of what it is that's causing these things, the truth is our awareness and global generational acceptance that this is happening on a historical scale is moving fairly fast. People are right to say that it's not moving fast enough, that we're not acting in a macro systemic way fast enough. But I do think that the era of denial is falling behind us. Even with this unbelievably regressive decision in the United States to pull out of things, the truth is, and I think this ties very nicely, to be honest, Jan and I were talking about this, Transatlantic's theme of global and local. The citizens of the United States do not need Donald Trump to stay in the Paris Climate Accord, because the state of California and the state of New York alone are the third largest economy in the world. And if those states commit to meeting then the United States will meet its commitments. If 40 or 50 mayors in the United States of cities say, we're going to meet these commitments, the citizenry of the United States can collectively meet the Paris climate commitments without permission of the federal government. And I think that's actually quite inspiring. I think it's important to remember that. At lunch, we were talking about what's going on in Poland today, politically. These things are, we're in a moment in which many people are quite shocked and fearful about the apparent deconstruction of democratic principles, of all kinds of things. But I think it's very important to remember that in the modern era especially, technology, the network effect of the global community, it's much harder to isolate us. It's much harder for the political matrix to isolate people and control them. And we can do a lot without permission and without waiting for national political policy. And the truth is, even the matrix of the corporate construct that wants to sustain non-sustainable carbon energy and all these things can't win. It's falling. Germany has had a day where it's produced its entire energy demand by renewables now. It is over. There is no, it is happening. The global energy system is changing. Dirty fuels are going to die. And it's not going to matter if we have these blips like Donald Trump saying it can't happen. So to me, the challenge is not, it's actually, of course it's important for our generation to continue to really absorb and dig in to the details of what's happening. But I actually don't think that persuading the world that this is happening is the challenge anymore. I think the challenge is for people to, I think the challenge is for people to get people past the idea that they can't do anything about it, and help people. That's kind of, I think, Jan's idea of global and local is how do you get people to be concerned, even frightened about global issues, but not be paralyzed. Recognize that lots of local collective acts add up and will outmaneuver the political construct. And I think when we started CrowdRise, which is, it's a mostly US-based website, but we basically support, our platform lets people set up fundraising projects for any cause that they care about. And it's just moving, you know, and we, the average person who sets up a project on our site raises in the zone of $1,000 or $2,000. But across the 5 years we've run the site, it's raised $600 or $700 million US dollars now. So, you know, and whether it's individuals or cities or state, I think our capacity to create the shift through lots of determined local personal efforts is it's real, and it is actually happening. So Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, who I really admire on this front, has said, like, don't be depressed by this. It's contemptible, and it's almost, you know, it's, you know, but don't be depressed by it, because it doesn't actually mean this isn't a victory. All they're doing is, you know, fiddling for their corporate friends, but it doesn't mean they're winning. And I think that it's important to remember that, and I think it's important for people to remember that even in these moments where, you know, you guys were talking about it today, there's people in the streets protesting what's going on, which is important. But I also think, you know, like I was joking, but it's actually true. It can get worse. Like, we actually elected the guy, and it's mind-boggling. It's like living in a movie that you would throw the script away. You'd say, this is so stupid. This could never happen, but it's happened, and it's and on the one hand, it's terrifying, but I also think it doesn't mean they're winning unless we roll over and stop. And so I think to me, people our age and younger know that the environmental sustainability challenge is the defining challenge of the era we're living in. And I think that I'm optimistic that there are ways to move beyond, and that there are things that are going to happen that, you know, if you said to people in 1980, when we were like, that we'd all end up with a thing in our pocket that has the computing power of an IBM supercomputer, you'd be like, you know, within 20 years, you'd be like, give me a break, that's just crazy. And so I think the notion that we even know what's possible within the next 20 years is a little bit hubristic. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be ringing the bell and saying, hey, this is important, but I don't actually think we know how, you can never in the moment that you're in exactly know how fast things like solar energy are going to tip into this price to efficiency ratio where it just suddenly, it makes no sense to do anything else. And I think, it's a weird moment, because it's both frightening, and yet at the same time, there's lots of signals to me that a global citizenry can make these, that ultimately, you know, I think Exxon is going to suffer more than we are. I think, you know, I think we're going to win.
Well, I think that the crucial thing you said, sort of in between the lines, is that one cannot succumb to the fatalism in any way, because once you do that, then it's over. But as long as fatalism doesn't win, we can still change something. We still have time for 2 or 3 questions. So there's someone very.
And I have 2 questions. First is, which character that you played was most difficult to prepare, and which one you think is like really similar to you? And the second question is, because the Primary Fear is actually one of my favorite movies. The last scene at the end.
Which film?
Primary Fear.
Primary Fear.
That was a good title in Polish, I would say. In the end of the movie, there's a scene where you think everything's over, and then your character is just getting your hands, and laughing, it's like, ha ha ha. And I always get the feeling that it was improvised, or it was maybe the script. I don't know. Can you just tell it? What was it in the script, or you just made it?
There was a lot of debate on that film about what the ending exactly should be, and there was some talk that Richard Gere's character should win or get my characters, and I give it Richard Gere, I think, was very wise about it, because obviously he was the star of the movie and people were kind of looking, and he said, you're crazy. He said the best thing that can possibly happen is I'm standing at the movie with my shoulders slumped, defeated, like that's what, and so he had a kind of a great humility. There are people who would like to sometimes protect their character, or protect their image, and he had a great instinct to say, like, no, he should destroy me. But we played with many variations of it. They played with more subtle versions of it where you were one, the truth is, as anyone who makes films know, you don't always know. It's not, and the wonderful thing about film is it's so plastic and malleable, and it's like clay. When you shoot the movie, you're really just creating clay, right? You're not creating a movie. You're piling up a whole bunch of clay, and then you make a sculpture later. And that was my first film, but even then, it was a great learning experience, because you realize that you don't have to figure it out. You don't have to figure out anything, really, exactly, if you gather the right materials. And the person who was the real wizard of that I worked with was Milos Forman, who's, one of the all-time greats. And Milos, more than any filmmaker I ever worked with, Milos used to just watch and watch and watch things happening, and then he would suddenly say, "Great, yeah, we'll go to lunch," And I came out of the theater, and I was thinking to myself, like, we've been doing this for hours. Nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. We haven't done a scene. I kept looking for this. I kept looking for a performance of a scene that went from A, through to the middle, and then you say, "Oh, we got it. We got the scene that will be in the movie." And Milos was like a true sculptor. He would watch takes, just take after take. And what I realized later is that he had this incredible capability for mentally mapping. Like he would watch a take and say, "Okay, that's a great little piece, and I'm going to hold that here." And then he would watch another and go, "Oh, I got another piece." And in his mind, he knew, like a gas tank, almost like a gas tank getting full, he knew intuitively when he had enough to make the scene later. And that really actually melted my mind. Because if you watch Milos Forman's films, you think, oh my God, the performances, they're so crystalline. And you look at Amadeus and the way it's constructed, and there's just such a...
Imagine that there was this grand design of everything.
Yeah, everything about Milos Forman's films looks like he must have understood the balances on the day. And then on that, I learned that I think Milos's geniuses were casting, because he would cast people who, if they opened their mouth, they were right as the character, and then he was a masterful editor. And in between, he kind of just would rub his hair, and if you asked him questions, if you said like, he would go, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it. And I was always willing to talk. He'd say, you can have one question, you know, and I would say, you know, and he'd say, that's it, no, you know, I don't want to talk, it's great, let it go. He really was an incredibly, so I think, you know, I don't know if, you know this book that Ralph Rosenblum wrote? Ralph Rosenblum was a great film editor he cut Annie Hall, and he cut many great films, and he has a book called When the Shooting Stops, the Cutting Begins. And if you're interested in film, I think this is a really great book. But there's a chapter about Annie Hall, which also for me and for many of us, you know, if you watch Annie Hall, you think, this is a filmmaker at the peak of his creative powers. This is a guy who can do anything he wants. He can throw animation into it. He can turn and talk to the camera in the middle of a scene. He can
Subtitles.
He can put subtitles. He can cut to himself. He can do anything that he wants. And he must just have known in his mind what he was doing. And if you read the story of how Annie Hall evolved as a film, you realize it's the exact opposite. He started off making a totally different film, a film with a different title, where Diane Keaton's character was a small piece of it, and as he watched it, and it wasn't working, he would go back out and shoot other pieces, then add them and go back, and he kept watching the film and seeing what the film said to him, and then changing and adding until, and many of the most famous things he added at the very, very, very last second. And to me, having experiences like with Milos or reading that, it really, it changed my whole view of not even just making films, but the creative process in general, because you realize that a lot of the best people are people who have the courage to just allow it to keep unfolding to them, and they don't walk into it with the certainty that they know, you know, exactly what it's going to be. And people who try to control things super tight often end up on the rocks. And I think it's the people who keep watching the evolution of the piece and making themselves available to how it's changing often are the ones that somehow produce these things that we all look at and say, oh, well, that's the work, that's a master at work, but the mastery is not necessarily perfect control. It's being open-minded.
It's not like holding to your preconceived notion of what the film should be. Slowly, we'll have to end, but there's still a question. So let's there we go.
Okay, so after the question, there was a question regarding your directional work. So what about the Homeless Brooklyn? That's your project.
The Homeless Brooklyn project.
Motherless Brooklyn.
Oh, Motherless, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Homeless is good. I meant Homeless Brooklyn. If it comes out like that, just remember that this guy came up with it. Say like, well, when we made Fight Club, Underground Circle, of course, in Poland. I think this should be a theme. Like I should get them all from you, and then
I will make you a list.
just start referring to it. It can be this inside joke that we have 1,500 people only who know why. I'm referring to the films by a different title. It's Motherless Brooklyn. I can't. I'm superstitious. So I would like to make it, and it's something I've written it, and I want to make it, and we're trying, but hopefully soon. Hopefully we'll
look
be
forward
here talking about
to it and to the title of it as well.
Yeah.
Last question.
We slowly have to end, but here.
Last question.
Sorry. Oh, there we go.
Edward, you are the best talk.
By the way, what do you think about the power of YouTube, power of television, about Netflix? What do you think about actors in Hollywood, which they want to play TV series? Do you think they take away the audience from cinema?
No, I don't. I mean, it's all moving very fast, and to me, it's all opportunity for creative people. I think that mediums change, and the way that stories, you know, the novel was the most powerful and widely distributed form for a while, and films, we have television. I don't really, I try not to, the idea of getting hung up on, or getting fixated on whether a film is presented in a certain way is, I think, a trap for a creative person. I think to me, the more there is, the more places that you can make something for it, the better. And I think that if the economics of theatrical film releasing shift in a way that make the companies that make those kinds of films lean a certain way, and it means that types of things that used to get only made in theatrical distribution get made on Netflix or in collaborations between studios and things. Great. I think it's great. I think it represents opportunity. And by the way, I think it will go, you know, to me, this is a music festival too, so I remember I saw Radiohead play this tiny little club in New York in like 1996 or 7, and I got to know those guys, and at the time they were writing OK Computer, and Tom, those guys, they were talking about the frustrations of record company releases and all these types of things. And so cut to a couple years later, when those guys put out In Rainbows, they make their record themselves, and they make their own microsite, and they say, pay whatever you think it's worth, right? And this to me was like, I was looking around like, is anybody paying attention to this? I was like, this is a big deal. This is, you know, I've said to Wes Anderson, let's make something, let's make a serialized film that we make it for, you know, $2 an installment, and we put it online, you know, the next WesAndersonMovie.com, and let's do why does Radiohead get to do this, and we have to, these things will keep shifting, and the more they shift, the more we should all experiment. I think we should, and you know, I was talking to Alejandro Iñárritu like 2 months ago in LA. I hadn't seen him in a little bit. I said, what have you been doing? And he said, oh, cabron, I've been downtown, like, he goes, I'm downtown, I'm going crazy out of my mind. And I said, well, what, with what? He goes, the VR. And I said, what? And he goes, the VR. And I said, like he was saying, the VR, virtual reality. And I said, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's like, and I said, it could well be. We were talking about this at lunch today also. And Alejandro's been shooting this this short narrative in virtual reality that's at the LA County Museum now. And he said, he was like, cabrón, I don't know what I'm gonna do. He's like, this is the only way I can think now. You know, and he goes, but how are we gonna, who am I gonna give it to? Like, how's it gonna, you know? But this is exciting. I mean, this is exciting. I think you've got to, the fact to me that Alejandro's working on VR, or that, you know, that artists like Radiohead or Wes, who have, arguably, they have their fans, you know, they can make things and we can deliver them, you know, directly. We've only begun, I mean, you know, so to me, with all respect, I think, you know, Netflix and streaming and all, this is a revolution, it's a certain thing, but I think it's like a halfway marker on the way to where we're probably really going, and I think, I don't think that we're gonna stop getting together in big spaces to watch a lit up screen, because I think we're like cave people, and we like to get around a fire and tell a story, and there's an effect. Theater hasn't gone away. We haven't stopped going to the theater to see plays. It has a different effect. It has a different effect on the brain. There's something about the social nature of going to see things, and I think the evidence is that we do like to go to theaters to see Avatar more than we even want to see that at home, and that's a movie I'm really happy I saw in the theater, right? I don't think it's going to go away, but I do think that we're in the 1.0 moment of totally exploding not only the whole mechanism by which creative people take their work out to other people, but I think, to your point, the entire form of the experience might change. We were talking at lunch about what will it be like when you can tell totally immersive stories, if even like the frame of the lit world is now completely around you and you're inside it, it will change everything. And I think it doesn't mean other things will go away, but it'll just mean that it all keeps evolving. And I think it's great. I think it means, frankly, what it means is that there's opportunity for someone in their first year at Wots Film School to actually do something. You know what I mean? To do something more than write the next Steven Soderbergh-like movie for Poland. You know what I mean? It's like, that's not like writing, you know.
Actually carve out a new space.
There's gonna be a whole new space for people coming into film school right now, and it's gonna melt the mind of people who, you know, and that's what it should be. Otherwise we'll be recycling stories as we always do, and there'll be really nice films and all these things, but we won't have a really, like, you know, the people who make the first really great VR films, those are going to be like, those people are going to go down with, like, you know, like Lumiere, and like, yeah, I mean, they're going to go down with like the people at the leading edge of the next wave of cinema and stuff. And so I think that's you know, that's very enviable.
That will be a time where when even Avatar will seem quaint by comparison, I guess.
I mean, I think it's a pretty fascinating moment and I think the fact of it is that even these things of like, where we get Ida and we get a good, but then I don't know about the next 10 things that you guys all think are, this will completely evaporate too, because I think, like, you know, regional distribution construct, it'll all just, it's already started. That's what I thought was so cool about the Radiohead thing. It was like, hey, we know who our global fans are. We don't need to really, it's like, here, just go online, radiohead.com, pay for our record. And this is really exciting. I think it means that artistic communities will totally shift and become.
Well, we went just a little bit over time already, but so we'll slowly. Sorry,
can I ask
one last question? One last question. Okay.
From sitting in the theater, I'm a huge fan. So, do you have plans to be involved in the theater in the near time? Maybe not necessarily as an actor, but maybe as a director. And the second thing is the Shakespeare Head. a huge impact on you. And we're having the Shakespeare's Festival in Gdańsk like next week. So
We'll stay a little longer for the Shakespeare Festival in Gdańsk.
portray one of the Shakespeare's character. Which one would that be and why?
Which Shakespeare character would you like to play?
Would I like to play?
Uh-huh.
That's
You're already in Macbeth, we established that.
yeah, no,
Lady Macbeth.
I'll come up with something. Yeah. I think that I don't know. See, I have this issue with, because I've been asked to do Shakespeare things and everything. In some ways, I'm a victim of being a fan, because I'll, for instance, you know, like Coriolanus is a strange and difficult play. Rafe's movie of it is so good, and he is so good that it's over for me. It's done. That one's off the books. There's no way. There's no way. I like he.
Coriolan in Polish.
Yes, yeah.
Close.
And I tend to, unfortunately, hold on to really great performances that I've seen because they affect me a lot, and because I'm lucky or whatever, I feel like I've seen so many of the great Shakespeare roles done by some of the greatest people that I feel like why would I only vanity really would lead me to do this, and I don't need I even feel that way about and this is with all respect to anybody else who ever steps into it. Like, I'm not the right actor to play Stanley Kowalski anyway, but even if I was, I don't think I could ever get my obsession with like Brando's Kowalski 60 years later out of my mind. Like, I couldn't. There's things that as a fan of films and acting and performances, I can't get beyond it in some ways, and I think and in a way, it's not my ambition, honestly. Like, I'd rather like, if you say, why am I drawn to Motherless Brooklyn, this novel, this character, it's because in my mind I think to myself, this is a character that I have not seen. I have a good idea of what I think it is. And if I can hit it right, this will be very memorable. Like, he will be a very crystalline, unique thing, and that's something that I still aspire to. Also because that story happens to be about some of the things that we're living through, I think, vulgar obsession with power and anti-democratic forces and things like that. So I'm drawn to it sort of here, but on an acting level, it's not like no one else has ever done it, but I know this can be something I can make. Right. And that still kind of fires my aspiration. I think I just have, either my memory is too good or I'm too much of a fan to try to step into certain people's shoes.
Well, but that's also a very admirable quality in you, that humility sort of, you know, I mean, that you are actually seeing yourself in that light. Although originally I was planning to ask you as well, what was it like to work with Brando, because you did work with him on the score. Were you intimidated to step on the same set with Robert De Niro and Brando?
Fortunately, I knew both of them for a while before it, so there was that sort of effect was past, and I had gotten to be friends with Marlon, and it wasn't it wasn't intimidating by the time we did it, because I already was friendly with them, and they were both really nice to me. There was it also, any little, the first time that we worked together in one scene, the three of us, I let myself, for a moment, I thought, this is good. This is why I did this. But this is a true story. It's not. We had been working really late in the nights before Bob had me, and then we were doing this thing the next day with Marlon, and it was the first thing, and they did a thing, and the first time that I worked with the two of them, Marlon, I was supposed to speak, and then Marlon was supposed to speak, and we were both telling something to De Niro's character, and then he was supposed to say something. And so I said my stuff, and Marlon was saying his bit, and it was great what he was doing, but he was pouring himself a glass of water, and he was talking, and he was so into it, and he poured the water down the outside of the glass, and it was running down his shirt and sort of pooling in a big stain on his pants, and he didn't notice it, and I couldn't help it. I was watching, like, it's, and then like, if you're De Niro, I kind of was like, I looked over at Bob to just see if he was noticing it, and he was falling asleep like this, and then someone noticed this thing, and they said cut. They said cut, and Bob went, and then he looked at me and he went, was I falling asleep? And I said, yeah. And he was like, you know, and so I sort of like, one of them is pouring water down his pants and the other one is asleep, so it's just kind of like, we're okay, everybody's human. But I think that it was pretty good. Marlon, I think, for anyone to know, I think he was like he was a person who I think is a good example to like people who are getting into. He couldn't allow himself to love what he did. You know, to me, the saddest thing about Marlon is this incredibly sensitive talent. You know, he was associated with like this masculinity because of this one role, and because he broke open this idea, this whole new mode of very visceral performance, and he had a huge impact. But because of the things that end up conferring to people around, you know, artistic stuff, he hated all that so much that he like threw away his love of the thing with it. And I always thought that's a real shame. I mean, that's a terrible shame. He also was in a strange era where his talent was so cutting edge. He had such a progressive kind of a talent. He had a very modern
There's no way to accommodate
capacity.
it.
There weren't enough people writing for him, literally. I mean, he had Elia Kazan, and he had these things, and he did these great pieces of work when people tied him into it. But the truth is, I actually think he was so ahead of his. He transformed people's sense, and I actually don't even think the filmmaking and the writing was fully engaged. I almost think he would have been better served later. But more than that, I think when you're young, I think if things happen to you that in anything that create a certain cynicism in you, you know, you're doing something that you love doing, but then inevitably a whole bunch of shit comes with it. Whether it's arguments creatively, or it's the dynamics of doing the work, or it's the business around doing the work, it challenges you to kind of keep the pure relationship with just doing the work itself. And he, to me, ended up a victim of his own. He kind of created this sense of self-loathing. I think he suffered from hating himself for doing it for money and stuff. instead of walking away from it. But he couldn't just he couldn't separate the things that he hated about being well known and being venerated from the work itself. And I think that I've talked to other actors who knew him and stuff, and to me, he's like almost like a cautionary tale. It's just like, I think you have to, it's not even just for actors, I think musicians, for anybody who is trying to do something expressive and pure, and then the complications come into it, it's war. It's like from that point forward, you're in a battle for your life to retain the purity of your relationship to the thing you do.
The theme of Birdman, but
yeah,
basically.
It is, actually. I wasn't thinking of it that way, but yes, and I think that the thing that was touching to me, and it did affect me about working with him, was it made me realize it can be ruinous to your life, it can be ruinous to your spiritual life if you let the negative things that inevitably come with success, or even just the attempt to do a thing that you love, come into it. You have to meditate and be courageous and sustain your positive relationship with doing the work, and push the rest to the side and call it something else. Almost like acknowledge it, and because it can destroy. I think it can destroy you, and I think it did sort of destroy him. And I know, other people who somehow they keep they kept it in balance, and I think that's sort of, have you ever read Václav Havel's essays? He says, Václav Havel has one essay I really recommended called Second Wind, and it's basically about his life as a playwright, disgorging all of the things he felt as a young man, and then having success, and then all the politics of the success and the politics of his work, and all this stuff happening with the government and the communist government, and all these things, and having to get to a place where he almost had to just wipe the slate and think about what was the second part of his creative life going to be, so that he didn't just repeat himself and also didn't get cynical and everything. It's an amazing, amazing piece of writing about an artist confronting, he got what he wanted. He wrote things and they were well received, and then he had to deal with it. And how do you keep your sense of fire alive? And it's a great essay.
Well, I feel inspired. I think everyone here, sitting here today in Teatr Wielki in Łódź, feels inspired by what you just said. We will have to wrap up right now, but I just want to say on behalf of Transatlantic, on behalf of Jan and Joanna Łapińska, the programming director, that it's with deep gratitude that we receive you here as our guest. We will never forget this meeting, and thank you so much for gracing us with your
It's
presence.
a great festival, and Jan is totally inspiring to me, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.